Yeah, I mean, there were 7 weeks of evidence, 40 witnesses, which have resulted in this 170-odd page inquiry. Answers, finally, for the family of Dawn Sturgis, who, at the centre of this, was an innocent member of the public, an innocent mum of 3 in Wiltshire who was caught, as the inquiry heard, in the crossfires of an illegal, international and outrageous assassination attempt. When we look at the key findings, it is that top line that ultimately the moral responsibility for the death of Dawn Sturgis falls on those Russian agents who came to Salisbury, as well as the Russian president himself, Vladimir Putin. The inquiry said that all were morally responsible for her death. You'll remember, of course, that those agents had claimed that they had come to Salisbury as tourists to come and visit the cathedral. We heard from Lord Hughes about that at the start of the publication of the findings regarding the president's direct involvement.
Her death was needless and arbitrary. She was the entirely innocent victim of the cruel and cynical acts of others. Petrov, Bosharov and Fedotov were, as I've said, members of an operational team within the GRU. I am sure that in conducting this attack on Sergei Skripal, they must have been acting on instructions received from their superiors. And I've concluded that the operation to assassinate Sergei Skripal must have been authorized at the highest level, indeed by President Putin.
And Dan, we also heard in the last half an hour from Dawn's family, and they were particularly angry, weren't they, at the initial portrayal of Dawn by the media. What have they been saying today?
Yeah, I mean, they gave evidence during the inquiry, including Dawn's mother. One of the key questions answered in the inquiry as to whether or not Dawn received adequate medical care when that 999 call came in. Remember, 4 months this was after the assassination attempt on the Skripals. This was when Dawn had sprayed what she thought was perfume over. Of course, we now know that in that bottle was enough novichok to kill thousands of people, the inquiry heard. Now, the inquiry ruled that her medical care was entirely appropriate from both ambulance staff and hospital doctors, and that her condition was unsurvivable. Essentially, no treatment would have saved her, given the dose that she had of novichok. But we did hear, after the publication, from Marcia Willis-Stewart, who is the family's solicitor, as well as Dawn's father, Stan Sturgis.
Skripal was described by Putin as a traitor and convicted of treason. Yet, there were no sufficient and regular assessments of the risk he faced from Russian retaliation. As we have always believed, that put the British public at risk and led to Dawn's death. Today's report does not set out publicly how the risks that led to Dawn's death will be prevented in the future. Adequate risk assessment of the Skripal was not done, but no protective steps were put in place. That is a serious concern for us now and for the future.
We can have Dawn back now. She's been public for 7 years. We can finally put her to peace.
Well, the reaction there from Stan Sturgis and the family's legal team. There are other questions answered in this lengthy document, one as well about whether first responders should have increased training between the symptoms of a drug overdose, something that was initially thought had been the reason for Dawn falling ill. That was incorrect, and Wiltshire Police subsequently apologised for that assertion. The difference between the symptoms of that and indeed a nerve agent overdose. Wider training is now given. The inquiry said that that should be more widely circulated, but the inquiry did find that that training would have had no bearing on Dawn's death. She was, quote, beyond recovery before first responders were actually able to reach her. Russia, of course, has always denied any involvement in the assassination attempt on Sergei Skripal, and it says that it was a blatant provocation by the British authorities aimed at discrediting Russia.
Dan, thanks a lot. Now, as you've heard, the UK has imposed fresh sanctions on Russia's military intelligence and summoned the Russian ambassador to the Foreign Office. Our political correspondent Mario Aurora has the details.
Every time we see sanctions on Russia, we hear that it's, the next step, an unprecedented level of sanctions, and yet they keep coming, and we keep seeing more and more of these raft of sanctions announced. These specifically around that novichok poisoning and the tragic death of Dawn Sturgis. But the difficulty really is that what is the Russian response? We haven't heard yet from the Russians about what they're going to say, but in the PM's statement in reaction to this, he also talks, and so did Don Jarvis, obviously, at the dispatch box there, about Ukraine and the focus on supporting Ukraine and trying to tie these all together, really to show there is a pattern of behaviour here when it comes to Russian aggression and Russian malign forces, really. But the difficulty is that, for now, Russia continues to wage that war on Ukraine, despite all of these global sanctions, and that must be of some concern to Western allies, European allies, as well as the Americans. Now, of course, this is specifically around the GRU, the Russian intelligence agency, sanctioning it in its entirety, trying to really send a message to Putin and the Russian regime on exactly what the UK is prepared to do and how far it is prepared to go. But nonetheless, we'll have to wait and see whether this really has a concrete impact on Russian activity here in the UK. I think what was interesting in the dispatch box there was Dan Jarvis was talking about the government plans and what the reasons behind it and the justification for it. And the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp, was very in agreement and very much happy to accept and commend really what the government is doing. The only little area, I would say, of disagreement, let's argue, is around China. And at one point, Chris Philp basically criticised Labour for not being tough enough on China and basically saying, hold on a second, you're getting tough on Russia, but what about China? And actually China needs to be looked at and needs to be potentially either sanctioned or security needs to be tightened, especially around that plan for the super embassy in central London, potentially decision coming in January, although it's been postponed about 3 times so far since Labour came to power, so we'll see if that does get pushed back once again. But that was really the only area where the Conservative Party wanted to pick a bone, really, with Dan Jarvis and the Labour government. But apart from that, both sides very much united on these sanctions and what they're intending to do.